before we can really start to make any decisions around EQ and dynamic control with these drums, then we've got to set up a static balance. As you've seen, just by having the faders all set at the same value, in this case -4 dBs, there's no significance about that number, it just happens to be where they're set. The balance captured or baked into the files is very good. So that gives us an indication also of where the band want us to go with this drum mix. So what if you don't have that luxury of being given that helping hand? How do you go about starting to build a static mix for drums? To keep your perspective, it's great if you can try and do this as quickly as possible, so you can react and listen to your gut instinct with regard to the balances here. A good place to start is with the overheads, because the overheads are placed over the entire drum kit and they capture the entire drum kit. So it's good practice to listen to those first of all, to have a listen and see if there are any problems first of all with those overheads, but mainly just to get an idea and feel about the sound of the drum kit as a whole. So when you're listening to the overheads, listen to what you've been given. And there I hear a really balanced capture of the entire drum kit. No one drum feels too loud or too quiet. Nothing feels out of balance with regard to frequency as well. There's a lot of sub-energy with the kick that's been captured, but the cymbals as well have been captured quite nicely. That was a verse though, so let's check what's happening in a chorus, which is when usually the cymbals start to come in much stronger. You can get a sense there that the microphones are obviously closer to the cymbals because the cymbals sound more focused than the drum shells. But that's normal, and that's what you would expect to hear in a set of overheads. Now, there are two approaches you can take with overheads. You can either use the full fat sound, as I call it, so the full frequency spectrum, and blend the rest of the spot mics into that overhead, stereo overhead capture. Or you can change the focus slightly over to rely more on the spot mics and less so on the overheads, and really only rely on the overheads for reproduction of the cymbals. The benefit of that is that you end up with a much tighter drum sound, less roomy sounding, and that will lend itself to certain genres of music, depending on the style of music you mix. In this case, with it being a rock mix, a conversation with the band is probably wise to have to clarify whether they like a more traditional sounding drum kit or whether they would rather have a more modern sounding focused drum kit. And when I say a traditional sounding drum kit, I'm talking about where you would retain a lot of the character of the overheads and EQ the spot mics to fit into the overhead capture. For me, this decision comes really once I've got all the faders into a good position and I can just make some decisions on the quality of the individual spot mics and how they're interacting with the overheads before I decide how I'm going to treat the overheads. Normally I'll bring in the kicks first, then the snares, and then the toms into this capture. And then after that, we can talk about room mics and the hi-hat mic. got onto the snare here. We've got 2 snare mics, both different types of microphones, and we've got a choice of using both of them to create the snare sound or just using one. And in order to decide which one should be the lead or to decide the blend of the two, just by pulling them back out and listening to the snare in the overheads and listening to the tonality of it in the overheads, you can get a picture roughly and try and replicate that by bringing in the individual snare mics. Already there's some investigation I need to do with regard to the second snare mic. Just need to check phase, and we'll get onto that in a few minutes. Kind of losing a bit of tonality there, bringing in the AKG microphone. So I'm going to pull it out for now actually, and we'll move on to that in a minute. So let's get on with the rest of the tracks. Okay, so I've just used the top microphones there. Again, similarly with the snare, when we start blending in another microphone, we've got phase to consider. So for now, I'm just going to leave those lower tom mics out of the equation. Just move on to the hi-hat. Okay, so that's a really great trick. Just bring the hi-hat so that it's very audible, then bring it down to where you think it's about right, and then mute it. And if you can hear it disappear or get more quiet, then that's a good spot to use as a starting point. What I want to do, now I've set the toms, I just want to listen across this tom heavy section here. It's a breakdown section. There's not an awful lot happening at the same time, but I just want to make sure that the toms sound good in that section. Okay, so the rack tom isn't being played during that, it's all the floor tom. So let's listen to the floor toms. Okay, so they sound pretty balanced there for now, that's great. Okay, still feeling happy with it. So let's listen to these rooms now. So we've got the rooms, when they're blended together, you get a really nice kind of overall picture of, or an image in your mind of the room that the drum kit are in. And that's a really great capture to have if it's not something that you've ever considered recording before, because it just, it's the natural reverb sound of the room they were recorded in. So let's bring those into the mix now. Just adds an extra space to the drum kit, and you perhaps notice when I've set a level, or I think a level sounds good, the first thing I do is mute it to make sure that I'm happy with the position that I've settled on in that particular moment. And muting helps your ear pick out that particular track in the blend, in the overall soup that is the drum mix, so that you can make your final decision on where to place the faders. Now, all the way through that process, I had a VU meter open so that I could keep an eye on what my levels are doing. The drum mix is the foundation of the mix. Everything is built around the drums, and arguably the drums are going to be one of the loudest elements of your mix. This is where I use a VU meter, and by building my drums around a certain number, and by hitting that particular number, then I know that I'm giving myself enough headroom at the end of the day on the mix bus to add processing wherever I need to during the mix, and then also to send it off for mastering if I need to. The VU meter I use is this Klang Helm, and the important part of using the VU meter is how it's calibrated. The cal number here is -14, and what that means is that when this needle reaches 0 here on the VU meter, it is roughly equating to -14 decibels. So the idea is that I'm setting all my drums, listening to all my drums at the same time, and what I'm looking for is that whenever my kick is played, that the meter is reaching approximately -7 VU. Let me show you that. Okay, so when I see that each kick hit is getting to -7, then I know I'm setting my drums in roughly the right spot to be able to apply some processing and continue with the mix. And then if we check it in the chorus, so you notice that it's certainly loud in the choruses, as you would expect, getting up to about 5.5 dB. So we might just consider bringing down all the drums a little bit to compensate for that. So let's see what that looks like. So that's nearer, and then let's just check that it's not too quiet in the verses now. Good, just brought it back up a dB. Yeah, that's good. All I needed to do there then was just bring the static mix that I'd created. All the levels just needed to come down by 1 dB, and it's then now on the VU meter, it's getting to my number. So I can close this VU meter now and get on with the rest of the mix. So let's listen to the drums now in the mix and see if we feel as though we need to make any other level balance changes, because at the end of the day it's what the drums sound like in the mix that's most important. Pretty good start. Can't really hear the kick drum that much, so I need to work on that. Snare is very audible, and let's just check what the toms are doing. So after listening to the drums then with the rest of the instrumentation, felt as though the kick needed pushing to make it more audible. The snare felt a little bit loud, particularly in the choruses, so at the moment I've just found a middling position there for the snare. And then the tom sounded good in that middle 8 section as well. The rooms, they are going to have a great impact on how roomy the drums sound, and therefore how less focused they sound. So that I felt is adding really nice ambience. The issue is though that when it's in with the instrumentation, you kind of lose that effect. So you find that the drums sound much drier when you've got all the guitars and the bass and the synths in, and you need to push the room mics just to give them a little bit more space. And the space equals width and dimension. A great thing about room captures is that it allows the listener to feel or imagine the size of the room, the shape of the room that the drums are recorded in. And that certainly was an impact that I felt when I listened to music when I was just starting out. Okay, so that is our static mix for the drums. What we need to do now though, to really complete the static mix, is to look at some of the panning choices now with regard to the drums. If you have a look at what I've already done, you'll see that we've got some stereo tracks that we are dealing with. So we have the stereo room, which is currently at 100% fully panned hard left and right. And they're panned 80% left and right. The reason for that is that I want to leave some room on the edges for other instruments, namely the guitars. And if you'd got the overheads panned fully hard left and hard right, as well as the guitars, usually in the choruses, then everything can get a little bit busy on the outsides. And also by keeping the overheads narrowed a little bit like this, you really do feel the impact of a chorus coming in, getting wider with the guitars. It gives the guitar space on the edges to sit and not get overly harsh by cymbals also interacting with the higher frequencies of the guitar. So just by keeping them narrowed a little bit just helps with that perception of width in the choruses. The other panning choices we need to make are with the toms. And let's solo the overheads and listen to the placement of the toms in the overheads. Okay, so you hear the rack tom is on the right and you hear the floor toms are over on the left. Now we don't have to really tune in and spend an awful lot of time making sure that we pan the spot mics exactly to the position of these toms in the overheads, because we can explore the opportunity of making them sound a little bit wider than they actually are. And the combined effect of their natural position in the overheads with our perhaps more exaggerated position on the spot mics can just open up the toms to sound as though they're taking more space than they actually are, and therefore be perceived as being slightly more powerful and big in the mix. So I'm going to solo up the rack tom, and we've got our rack up and down bust to a auxiliary tom bus. So go back to this view here. Here's our tom bus, and by busing the two tom mics into this mono auxiliary here, we lose the functionality of the pan pot and it's transferred over to the bus. Now the rack tom in the overheads was just felt a little bit right of centre, and I want it a little bit wider than that. Just want it a bit further away from the centre, because down the centre we've got the vocals and we need to make space for those. So you can hear how the spot mic is panned slightly wider than the actual capture in the overheads. So let's do the same thing then with these floor toms. The floor toms are on the same side as each other. So let's take a listen to those. And the other. So in actual fact, the floor tom 2 is just happening on that second hit. Okay, so just that second section there, this is what is the floor tom 2, and this is just spill. So I'm just going to mute that because we know it's not floor tom 2. And it looked like it was just been missed in the cleanup section, so that's fine. So back to our view here. So that sounds as though floor tom 1 is slightly narrower than floor tom 2. So the floor tom 2 is the one that's out widest on the kit. So I'm going to take the floor tom 2 bus and take that out to 95, and I'll narrow the floor tom 1 down to 80. And there's no kind of rules around this, just set them to where they sound good to you. Now those two floor toms, you could pan them to both the same position if you wanted to. I just like to separate them a little bit to give them each their own space in the mix. So you'll notice that when you're creating the static mix, by pushing the fader a little bit beyond where it should really go, and you can hear it sounding a little bit loud, then you can just pull it back and you could just find the sweet spot between where it's blatantly too loud and where it's blatantly too quiet. And then you can just massage the faders to find the best spot for the static mix in the drums. And you can use the same technique, that pushing too far and then pulling back. And then the muting to really make sure you've not pulled back too far and that your instrument is still audible in the mix. You can use that technique throughout the whole mixing process, not just on drums. The other thing that's left remaining to pan is the hi-hat, so let's have a listen to that. So you can hear it's just off centre, off to the right again, so let's do that. in here again there, just playing around with the fader, making sure that we can actually hear it and it is contributing to the mix. Now, you may not need to use the hi-hat every time you mix drums. Oftentimes there can be plenty of hi-hat in the overhead mix. So even though I'm choosing to use it here at this moment, it might be that when we get further into the drum mix, I might find it's a little bit too overpowering and decide not to use it at all. And that's a pretty common thing to happen when mixing drums, so don't worry about deciding not to use the hi-hat. Okay, where are we at now? Okay, it's good, I think. Let's check the chorus. Okay, in the choruses I think we've got too much in the way of cymbals. So I'm going to fade out these overheads and rebalance them. So you can hear there's quite a lot of cymbal there, and cymbals are the things that you have to treat with a good amount of attention, because oftentimes it's cymbals that can get really washy, brittle, harsh sounding and ruin your drum mix. So for me right now at the moment there seems to be a lot, even though we've got the overheads faded out. So let's see if we can find where they are and tame them in the overall drum mix. Okay, so there is a lot of cymbal on the room mics. Now I know I like the effect of the rooms on the space and ambience it was putting around the kit, but I also know that the cymbal sound in the rooms is just a little bit too powerful. That feels more controlled, but noticeably the ambience has disappeared now around the kit. Let's see if we can bring some of that back by bringing back the overheads into the mix. Don't forget we're going to be bringing in drum reverb so we can counteract that dryness that we're now experiencing by bringing down the room sound. So that's feeling, the cymbals now are feeling good in the choruses. One last check in the verses. And with the instruments. And then the chorus. So remember, it's the cymbals that I'm listening for here. So that sounded good. I'm happy with that static balance right now. And what have we learned through this process of creating this static balance? We've learned that there's a lot of cymbals in the rooms, so they're going to need some control with some EQ, possibly some multi-band compression to really grab hold of them and keep them from poking out of the mix. We've learned that the 2 snare mics, that there is some sort of phase issue with them because of how the tonality of the snare changed when we started to fade up the second snare mic. We've panned the instruments in accordance to where they're sitting in the overheads. So what we've done so far, step 1, is we've done some preparation to our tracks. We've listened to them. We've listened to them as a drum mix, and we've listened to them in context of the other instrumentation. We've done some cleanup with the tom mics, so we've removed the bleed so that the drum kit can sound as tight as possible, less roomy and washy. And we've set our initial rough balance or static mix of all the individual drum tracks. And we used a VU meter to listen to the drum mix as a whole, and by looking at the value on the VU meter of the kick drum in our drum mix, we're able to ensure that we're going to have enough headroom at the end of the day on our mix bus. We're listening to rock music, so we want to make sure that our kick and snare are audible, and they most certainly are at the moment, but there is most definitely scope to work with them with EQ and compression to really make them hit home for this rock track.